When people see an old Cherokee blowgun today, a lot of them ask the wrong question. They ask whether it really worked. I think the better question is this: if our people already had bows and later had access to firearms, why did the blowgun stay around for generation after generation? Because it did. This wasn't some toy made for children after the real hunting tools had been put away. It was a piece of river cane, sometimes several feet long, paired with a small dart, no bowstring, no powder, no metal barrel, just cane, a dart, a person's breath, and enough practice to put that dart where it needed to go. And that's where this story becomes interesting, because the blowgun didn't survive by trying to compete with a bow. It survived because it didn't need to. It had its own job. And once you understand what that job was, you begin to understand why something so simple could remain useful, even while the world around Cherokee hunters was changing. Our people lived in a country of forests, rivers, thick vegetation, fields, steep ground, and animals of very different sizes. You don't approach every animal with the same tool. A deer isn't a squirrel, a turkey isn't a rabbit, and a tool powerful enough for one job can be unnecessary for another. That sounds obvious. But when people imagine old hunting, they sometimes picture one weapon replacing another. First spear, then bow, then gun, as if every new technology simply pushed the older one aside. Real life doesn't always work that way. A good tool survives when it keeps solving a problem. And for Cherokee hunters, the blowgun kept solving one. There is an 18th century account that gives us a remarkable glimpse of just how normal the blowgun once was. Lieutenant Henry Timberlake traveled through Cherokee country in the early 1760s. He wasn't Cherokee, and I want to make that clear. He was an outsider writing down what he believed he saw. So his words have to be read with that in mind. But one of his observations is difficult to ignore. Timberlake described Cherokee children, some only 8 or 10 years old, already skilled with what he called a hollow cane. They blew small darts through it while pursuing smaller animals and birds. Think about the age for a moment. 8, 10. That tells me something more important than how far a dart could travel. The blowgun wasn't simply an object hanging on a wall waiting for an adult hunter. Children were learning with it. That means the tool was also part of how skill moved from one generation to another. You learn how to hold steady. You learn distance. You learn patience. You learn that an animal rarely stands where you want it to stand. And, probably most important, you learn that missing teaches you more than talking about accuracy ever will. Cherokee Nation today explains that several traditional games developed skills that could translate into hunting and warfare, and blowgun contests are included among them. That connection makes sense. Before somebody becomes a good hunter, they have to become good at watching, at waiting, at controlling movement, at judging when to act and when not to. A blowgun demanded all of that, and there was no complicated mechanism to blame when you missed. The cane didn't pull the shot. A trigger didn't break badly. There was no sight to adjust. If that dart went somewhere other than where you wanted it to go, you had to learn something from it. I like that about old tools. They can be unforgiving teachers. But before we talk about the hunter, we need to talk about the plant. Because without river cane, there is no Cherokee blowgun, and river cane is one of those plants that people can walk past today without realizing how much history is standing in front of them. It looks enough like bamboo that many people assume it came from somewhere else. It didn't. River cane is native to North America. It once grew in enormous stands across large portions of the Southeast, particularly around floodplains, rivers, and streams. Those dense areas are called cane breaks. For Cherokee people and other indigenous peoples of the Southeast, cane wasn't a material with one purpose. It could become baskets, arrows, flutes, other useful objects, and of course, blowguns. That's another thing modern life can make difficult to appreciate. We think in terms of products. You need a basket. You buy a basket. You need a hunting tool. You buy a hunting tool. You need a container. You buy a container. But when your materials come directly from the country around you, knowing a plant means knowing many possibilities. River cane was not just something growing beside water. It was material, and generations of people learned what could be asked of it. For a blowgun, that long cane offered something very useful, a naturally tubular form. But don't mistake natural for finished. A piece of cane doesn't become an effective tool simply because somebody cuts it down. The old makers had to understand the material, which cane was worth taking, how straight it was, how it behaved as it dried, how to work with the natural divisions inside it, how to create a usable passage through the length of the cane. I'm deliberately not turning this into a step-by-step lesson on building one. That's not what matters here. The important thing is that what looks simple from the outside depended on knowledge of the plant, and that knowledge had to be learned. That's why I sometimes smile when somebody looks at an old object and calls it primitive. Simple and primitive are not the same thing. A wooden spoon is simple. Try making a good one with poor wood and no experience. A basket is simple until somebody hands you raw cane and asks you to make one. Blowgun looks like a tube until you have to select the material, prepare it properly, make the dart work with it, and then actually hit something. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian still holds Cherokee blowguns collected in North Carolina more than a century ago. One was collected from Ned Stamper of the Eastern Band of Cherokee in 1908. Another Cherokee example entered the collection from North Carolina after being collected around the turn of the 20th century. That matters because now we have something physical, not just a description in an old book. The objects survived, and some of the darts did too. One Eastern Band Cherokee dart collected in 1908 is recorded as being made of wood with material from a cattail seed head. Another later dart in the museum's collection was made by Eastern Band Cherokee artist Albert Crow. Different examples can preserve differences in material and craftsmanship, but together they prove something important. This was a living technology. People were still making it, still using the knowledge, still passing it on. Now, go back about a century and a half before those museum pieces. Timberlake is in Cherokee country. He sees children using hollow cane blowguns. At the same time, he also writes about Cherokee bows, arrows, and guns. That's the detail I want you to notice. The blowgun existed alongside those other weapons. It wasn't waiting for somebody to invent the bow. The bow was already there. Later firearms were there. And the blowgun still had a place. Why? Because hunting isn't a contest to see who carries the most powerful object. It's about matching the tool to the job. Cherokee hunting traditions used bows and arrows for larger game. For smaller animals such as squirrels and rabbits, the blowgun remained useful. And suddenly, the title of this story begins answering itself. Why keep using it? Because a rabbit doesn't require a deer weapon. Because a small game tool can remain valuable even when something more powerful exists. We still understand this principle today. A man who owns a chainsaw doesn't throw away every smaller cutting tool he owns. A farmer with a tractor still keeps hand tools. A kitchen with an electric mixer still has a knife. New technology doesn't automatically make an older tool useless. Sometimes it just narrows the job that older tool does best. That appears to be what happened here. And there was another advantage that has nothing to do with power. Practice. A young Cherokee boy could develop accuracy on small targets before he was taking on larger responsibilities in hunting. Cherokee Nation's own cultural information connects traditional blowgun contests with the teaching of skills that could carry over into hunting. That's important to me because it reminds us that hunting knowledge wasn't born the morning somebody decided to walk into the forest alone. It developed over time. A child who learns how to judge distance today becomes an adult who already understands distance tomorrow. A child who learns patience on a small target doesn't suddenly need to invent patience when the stakes become higher. The tool teaches habits, and habits travel with the person. There's something else about Timberlake's account that deserves attention. He was impressed with the accuracy of those young Cherokee shooters. Now, I don't want to turn that into one of those stories where every child could perform impossible shots. Historical observers exaggerated things. Human beings exaggerate today, and they certainly did in the 1700s. But we don't need an unbelievable claim. The point is that Timberlake saw enough skill to write about it. That's already significant. This wasn't somebody struggling to make a novelty work. He was watching a practiced skill. Imagine how many misses came before that. That's the part historical writing rarely records. Nobody writes down the afternoon a child missed 5 times. Nobody records the boring morning spent learning to steady a long piece of cane. Nobody preserves the countless ordinary corrections from an older person. A little higher, too fast. Wait, you're moving, try again. We don't have those conversations, and I won't invent them. But skill doesn't appear out of nowhere. Whenever you find somebody very good at a difficult physical task, somewhere behind them are hours nobody bothered to document. And that might be one reason the blowgun lasted. It wasn't only an object, it was a practice. Objects can disappear quickly. Practices are harder to erase when people continue teaching them. Then the Cherokee world changed dramatically. European contact brought new trade goods, new political pressures, new economic demands, and firearms. Hunting itself changed. Deerskins became tied into a much larger trade economy. A gun could obviously do things a blowgun could never do. Nobody needs to pretend otherwise. A firearm changed both hunting and warfare. But again, this is where the simple idea of replacement fails. The existence of the gun did not mean every old skill instantly vanished. That would be like saying the automobile arrived and therefore nobody ever walked again. The better question is whether the older tool still had a useful place. For the blowgun, the historical record says yes. By the early 20th century, collectors were still obtaining Cherokee blowguns and darts in North Carolina. And the tradition did not end in a museum cabinet. That is the part of this story I like most. You can trace the object backward, but you can also trace it forward. Cherokee Nation today still recognizes blowgun contests as traditional games connected historically to the development of hunting accuracy. And modern Cherokee craftspeople still make traditional river cane, blowguns, and darts. One Cherokee Nation artist, Max Tuttle, learned to make traditional river cane blowguns and darts through Cherokee cultural classes. Then he competed in the Cherokee National Holiday Blowgun Shoot. He won it twice. Just stop there for a second. An 18th century visitor writes about Cherokee children using hollow cane. Museum collections preserve Cherokee examples from the early 20th century. And generations later, Cherokee people are still making the tools and holding blowgun competitions. That is what continuity actually looks like. Not an object frozen in 1762, a practice that changes context but does not disappear. Once it helps bring small game. Later it can also serve as competition, teaching, craftsmanship, cultural demonstration, and a physical connection to older knowledge. The purpose expands, the meaning changes, but the skill remains recognizable. And I think that's a much better story than saying the Cherokee simply refused to give up an old weapon. They weren't preserving something because they didn't understand newer technology. Cherokee hunters adopted firearms. The historical record is very clear about that. The blowgun remained because usefulness and tradition can exist beside innovation. That's a lesson people sometimes have trouble understanding. We like clean timelines, old, new, obsolete, improved. But human culture doesn't move in a straight line. People keep what still works. They adapt what needs adapting. They stop doing some things. They revive others. They teach skills for reasons that may change across generations. That's not contradiction. That's culture. There's also one popular image of the blowgun that deserves some skepticism. Poison darts. Mention blowguns and somebody will eventually imagine a dart dipped in some mysterious plant poison. It makes for a dramatic movie scene, but drama isn't evidence. Researchers who have examined southeastern blowgun traditions have noted that there is no solid ethnographic or archaeological basis for treating poison as a standard feature of Cherokee blowgun hunting. The Cherokee examples preserved in museums are interesting enough without adding something we cannot prove. That matters to me, because once you begin respecting the actual skill involved, you don't need poison to make the tool impressive. A hunter had to get close enough. He had to see the animal before it saw enough of him to escape. He had to position a long piece of cane in dense country. He had to control his movement, and then he had to make the shot count. That is plenty difficult. In fact, focusing only on the dart can distract from the real skill. The hunter. The forest gives you very few perfect opportunities. Branches are in the way. Leaves move. Animals move. Your body moves. Light changes underneath trees. A good hunter isn't somebody who walks through the woods constantly firing. A good hunter spends a great deal of time not doing anything at all. Watching, listening, waiting. That's where a tool like the blowgun makes sense within a larger system of knowledge. The cane isn't doing the hunting for you. It amplifies what the person has already learned to do. And that brings me back to children. If Cherokee children were practicing with blowguns at a young age, then they weren't only learning to launch a dart, they were learning the beginning of woodcraft. How close can you move without being noticed? What does a squirrel do when it becomes suspicious? Where will a bird go after it leaves one branch? What sounds belong in the forest? And which sound did you make that didn't belong there? Those aren't blowgun skills. They're hunting skills. The blowgun gives them a place to develop. That's a very different way of looking at a traditional game or a competition. From the outside, you see somebody trying to hit a target. Inside the tradition, you're also seeing the preservation of hand-eye coordination, breath control, familiarity with the tool, and the discipline to repeat a movement until it becomes natural. And there is another character in this story that is easy to overlook. River cane itself, because the survival of a tradition can depend on the survival of the material that makes the tradition possible. The National Park Service estimates that river cane now occupies only a small fraction of the area it once covered in the United States. Those old cane breaks were dramatically reduced by land conversion, agriculture, grazing, development, and other changes to the southern landscape. Cherokee Nation lists river cane among culturally protected species. That connects the old blowgun to something happening right now. If the plant disappears from the landscape, something more than a plant becomes harder to pass down. Basket makers feel it. People preserving traditional arts feel it. Anyone who needs good river cane for an old practice feels it. So today, indigenous communities, conservation workers, federal agencies, and others have been involved in efforts to restore cane breaks. And I find something fitting about that. Centuries ago, knowledge moved from the riverbank into the hands of the maker. The maker turned cane into something useful. Then somebody taught the next person. Today, preserving that chain may require protecting the river cane itself. The cultural practice and the ecosystem are tied together. That's not romantic language. It's practical. You cannot preserve a river cane tradition without river cane. And maybe that explains something larger about why certain old skills disappear. We often assume people simply forgot. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the material disappears. Sometimes the landscape changes. Sometimes the person who knew how to do something dies before another person learns it. Sometimes the old skill still works perfectly well, but the world no longer creates many opportunities to use it. That makes the survival of Cherokee blowgun tradition more interesting to me, not less, because there were plenty of chances for it to disappear. Firearms changed hunting. Cherokee people were forcibly removed from ancestral lands in the 19th century, while some Cherokee remained in the southeast and eventually became the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Communities were separated by hundreds of miles. Land changed. Languages came under pressure. Traditional materials became harder to find in many places. And yet here we are. There are blowguns in museum collections. There are Cherokee craftspeople making them. There are blowgun chutes. There are people teaching the skill. There is river cane being protected and restored. That's why I wouldn't call this an obsolete weapon. I don't even think weapon is the best word for the entire story anymore. It's a hunting tool, a training tool, a competition tool, a craft, a piece of plant knowledge. And now, in many settings, a way of keeping cultural memory physically alive. You can read a paragraph about a blowgun. That's one kind of memory. You can look at one behind museum glass. That's another. But put river cane into the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing. Make the dart. Take the finished blowgun outside and use the skill. And now memory has movement again. Your hands have to know something. Your eyes have to know something. Your breathing has to cooperate. That is very different from remembering a date. And maybe that's why some traditions survive better when people continue doing them. The knowledge isn't stored only in words. Part of it is stored in the body. Anybody who has ever learned an old manual skill understands this. Someone can explain sharpening a knife for 20 minutes. Then you pick up the stone and realize your hands don't know what the explanation knows. Someone can describe splitting wood. Then you swing the axe yourself and discover where the real lesson begins. You can read every sentence ever written about shooting a blowgun. That doesn't mean you can hit the target. Physical knowledge has to be practiced. Which brings us back to that Cherokee child observed more than 250 years ago. What Timberlake saw was not simply a boy with a hollow cane. He was seeing knowledge being rehearsed. The child wasn't waiting until adulthood to suddenly become capable. The learning had already started, and generations later, people are still standing behind a line at Cherokee blowgun competitions, doing something their ancestors would immediately recognize. The context is different. The clothing is different. The world around them is almost unimaginably different. But the basic relationship remains. Person, cane, dart, target, skill, I don't think you need to add anything to that. And this is where I come back to the question we started with. Why did the Cherokee keep using blowguns for generations when they had bows and later guns? There isn't one dramatic answer. There are several very practical ones. The blowgun had a role in hunting smaller game. It gave young people a way to develop accuracy and hunting-related skills. Its main material, river cane, was part of a much broader Cherokee material tradition. And once hunting technology changed, the blowgun could continue as craft, competition, teaching, and cultural practice. It adapted. That may be the real reason it survived, not because Cherokee people refused to change, because the blowgun itself found different ways to remain useful. There's a big difference between those two ideas. Tradition does not have to mean doing everything exactly as it was done centuries ago. Sometimes tradition means knowing what part should not be lost while allowing the rest of life to move forward. Modern Cherokee people drive cars, use phones, work every kind of profession you can imagine. And somebody can still pick up river cane and know what that plant can become. One does not cancel the other. That's something I wish more people understood about indigenous traditions in general. They are not museum exhibits pretending time stopped. Living cultures change. They always have. The remarkable thing is not that something stayed completely untouched. The remarkable thing is when a thread survives all that change. The Cherokee blowgun is one of those threads. An outsider wrote about it in the 18th century. Physical examples survived from the 19th and early 20th century world. Museum collections preserve the tools. Cherokee Nation still recognizes blowgun competition. Craftspeople still make river cane blowguns and darts, and people are working to preserve the cane that makes those traditions possible. That's generations, not in theory, in evidence. So the next time somebody shows you a Cherokee blowgun and it looks too simple to be important, don't look only at the cane. Look at how long the knowledge had to travel to reach the hands holding it today. That's the part I find impressive. Not that our people had some mysterious weapon nobody else could understand. Nothing like that. It's more human than that. They had a tool that worked. They taught children how to use it. Those children became adults. Somebody taught the next generation. The world changed around them. The purpose changed with it. And still, the knowledge wasn't completely dropped. Maybe that's what makes an old skill worth preserving. Not because we need to live exactly as our ancestors lived. We can't. And they probably wouldn't expect us to. But when something carries observation, craftsmanship, discipline, and memory through that many generations, throwing it away simply because something newer exists would be a strange kind of progress. My ancestors didn't need every old tool to defeat every new one. Sometimes an old tool only needed to keep doing one thing well. The Cherokee blowgun did, and apparently that was enough to keep it breathing through the generations. So let me ask you something. If your grandparents or great-grandparents taught your family a skill that most people don't use anymore, what was it? Maybe it was hunting, maybe gardening, woodworking, canning food, repairing tools, reading weather, something small that never made it into a history book. Tell me about it. Because those are usually the things that disappear quietly, and once the last person who knows how to do them is gone, they're a lot harder to bring back. A piece of river cane can grow again, but somebody still has to remember what to do with it.